you're going to have to wait till April to see what we're publishing. In the meantime, what I'm going to tell you is our theory of journalism, like how we do this. So I'm going to start out with what we aim to do. We're a new publication illuminating how powerful institutions are using technologies that impact people in society. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use data science and data journalism to investigate the algorithms themselves. I'm going to walk you through two stories that I think you guys sort of like perused in the notes beforehand, sort of to outline the way we approach reporting on technology and reporting in general. And so here's the major one that we got, the main bar of the series that we got a Pulitzer nod for in 2016. It was about a criminal risk assessment score that basically what this score does is when you get arrested, they ask you 137 questions, and it spits out a likelihood on whether or not you're going to come back to jail within 2 years. That's interesting in and of itself that that algorithm exists. But what we did at ProPublica and what we hope to do at the Markup is investigate what the actual harm is behind algorithms like this, right? It's interesting that we have risk scores, but the risk scores might work. It's not really a story just to point out that these things exist for us. For other folks, you can do it. But for us, we really want to hold the powerful to account, to show that there isn't a lot of thinking about algorithms like this. So this particular algorithm was called Compass. And what it did was you'd get arrested. The cop would ask you 137 questions, including on topics like if you're poor, if you have no money, is it okay to steal bread to feed your family? Which might be a different answer depending on where you're from. Or probably more correlated with race, do you know anybody who has ever been to jail? In poorer neighborhoods, which is correlated with, especially in Broward County, Florida, where I grew up, in poorer neighborhoods, there's a lot more crime, there's a lot more policing than in whiter neighborhoods. And that we don't know how that, the answer to that question factored into your score, but we can sort of suss out that questions like that were correlated with race. And the way that we did that was we asked Broward County for all of their risk scores that they ever gave anybody. We got 18,000 risk scores, and at first we asked them for it, and they said it would be $11,000, and we hired a lawyer. And then they said, oh, no, just kidding. You guys can have it for free. So always hire a lawyer. It was $400. And we spent the next 6 months looking through all of, cleaning the data and merging these risk scores with people's criminal history. Immediately when we looked through it, we started to see patterns like this, right? So we got the data. We started looking through it. We saw sort of some indications that they were correlated with race. On the left is this teenager, Brescia Borden. Well, let's start with Vernon Prater. Vernon Prater got picked up, got convicted of felony theft and rated 3 low risk, meaning he's not going to come back to jail. The algorithm thinks he's not going to come back to jail. After he got out of after he served his time and got out, a week later he held up an electronics store for like $10,000, I think, and went back to jail. Brescia Borden, on the other hand, so he's supposed to be the safe one. Brescia Borden, on the other hand, was walking home with her friend, saw a bike, hopped on the bike, a kid's bike, just being a teenager, hopped on the bike, started riding around. Kid's mother came out and said, hey, Brescia, give back the bike. She gave back the bike, but her neighbor had already called the cops on Brescia. Brescia took the test. She had 2 prior juvenile convictions, but she got assigned a very high risk score. She has not gone back to prison yet. So we started seeing like patterns like this when we got the data back. And we did a little bit of preliminary analysis. And the way the score works is you have a score from 1 to 10, and 10% of each, every step should be the next 10% highest, right? So for African Americans, it's a decile. So what you should see is what's happening with African Americans. You should see about 10% getting a 10, another 10% getting a 9, all the way down to 1. But you see, this is the African American defendants' decile scores. But over here on the white defendants' decile scores, you sort of see this shift where it looks like a lot of people are getting 1s, right? So this is our first bit of analysis. This in and of itself didn't prove anything because we didn't look at how risky Caucasians were versus African Americans. To do that, we spent the next 6 months downloading criminal histories of everyone who got scored in Broward County, downloading and merging them together. We went back to Broward County and said, hey, can we FOIA you guys again? And they said, no. Why don't you just scrape our jail website? Which is the only time that anybody had ever told me, write software to download it yourself. Government agencies are usually, very not happy when you scrape their website because it means they go down or whatever. So we did that. We ended up with a data set that we could reliably, out of the 18,000 risk scores, we ended up reliably matching about half of them. So it depends on which number you're looking at, but anywhere from 6,000 to 8,000 criminal risk scores. And what we had then was we had the risk score that the algorithm spit out, plus we had people's criminal histories, plus we had whether or not they actually went back to jail, right? So we were able to test how predictive this algorithm was and look for bias. We ran a thing called a logistic regression, which controlled for whether or not they went back to jail, 2-year recidivism, whether or not they had a misdemeanor, number of priors that they had, their race and their age, and whether or not they were male or female. What a regression does is it allows you to correct for all of those other unknown factors. So you can say things, you can isolate the effects of being African American. You can see African American is significant and positive, which means that African Americans were controlling for all the other factors, whether or not they went back to jail, their risk, their underlying risk, whether or not they were young or old, controlling for all other factors, they were more likely to get a higher score. So there's some bias in this algorithm. The interesting part that hasn't been remarked on a whole lot, but is something that we do want to look into in the future. Women got a higher score, were rated more highly than men. So much so that a high risk woman was only as risky as a medium risk man. The company itself sold a plugin to their software for $20,000 where they promised to fix that problem, but Broward County didn't buy it. So they're misrating women, they're rating them more dangerous. That logistic regression model is good, right? That makes for a good academic paper. It's relatively hard to explain this in a story. And we're not academics, we're journalists, right? We need to go out into the world and say, look, here's the problem. So we relied on that for the fact that we were right. We published it in our white paper, which I think you guys looked at. That is the core of our argument, but we needed a very simple, digestible fact to rely on for the hook of our story. And so what we did is we looked at how often the algorithm rated people dangerous, and it was wrong about that, the false positive rate, and how often it rated people safe, and it was wrong about that, meaning that they went back to jail, the false negative rate. For African Americans, when you get rated dangerous, or more likely to recidivate, the algorithm is wrong about 40% of the time. For Caucasians or white defendants, it's only wrong 20% of the time. So this is a coin flip, right? You're dangerous, we think you're gonna come back, you're African American, you have a 50-50 chance of actually coming back. It's much more accurate for white defendants. It makes the opposite mistake for African Americans on and white defendants on the false negative rate. Again, the rate that it rates you safe and you're coming back. So it's more accurate for black defendants, and for white defendants, it underestimates white defendants' likelihood of recidivism. So if we go back here to explain this graph using those things that we knew 6 months on, this what's happening here, that it's skewed towards rating white defendants too low, is something that's actually happening on the ground. This algorithm actually is doing that. You'll notice that throughout this whole thing, we don't have to rely on anonymous sources, right? We don't have to rely on word of mouth. We don't have to rely on like algorithms are unknown black boxes. This could be dangerous for society. We actually come to the company with proof and say this is happening. It wasn't without controversy. There was a bunch of back and forth about it. We wrote a bunch of articles. The company published a 38-page white paper on how we were wrong, and then they went on to change their name and their URL and their domain, so you can't find it anymore. They took it down about a year ago. But that story is largely what we're trying to do at the markup. We heard this idea that the score existed. We had a hypothesis that it might not be that great because it was the company that made it and it's used nationwide. There were 3 people. Eric Holder, when he was Attorney General, one of his last speeches said someone should look into it. No one ever looked into it, so we looked into it. So we had a hunch that something was there. We had a hypothesis. We did a lot of work. We looked at the data, and it turned out that our hypothesis was correct. We did a similar thing the following year with car insurance, where we looked at, this one's a little bit easier to explain. We looked at the risk of car insurance in 4 states, including California. If you guys live in a white, more Caucasian neighborhood or whiter neighborhood, and not an underserved neighborhood, we caused your car insurance prices to go up. Because after we published this story, the California regulators used our method to regulate car insurance. And I'll show you what that means. So these are a bunch of sort of squinty graphs, but on the x-axis here is risk. So on average, how much it costs a car insurance company to write a policy. So they write a policy, they think they're going to be out $300. On the y-axis is how much they set your base rate, right? So how much they set your actual quote. And this is actually, I said base rate, but it's how much they set the quote for a 30-year-old female white driver. We got 24 million quotes. We bought them from a company. We ended up having to fact check their data because it was all garbage. So it took like 6 months again. So your data is always going to be garbage. You always have to make sure that it's right. And what you can see, this is Missouri, but what you can see, minority neighborhoods, the trend line is this red line here. And you can see that it's working the way that you think insurance would work. In more dangerous neighborhoods, your car insurance goes up. But in wider neighborhoods, what ends up happening is it still starts out maybe a little bit lower, but then it sort of regresses down, right? Like there's sort of like a discount out in these outer neighborhoods, out in these more risky neighborhoods. So they're not pricing car insurance correctly for these more wider neighborhoods. So when we showed this to California, the California insurance regulators, they said, yes, this is a problem. It wasn't this bad in California. This is Missouri, which was the worst. Some of these places are overpricing in the riskiest neighborhoods more than twice. And that's not explained by risk. When we showed the California regulators this, they at first they didn't believe us. And then 6 months later, they did their own study after trying to prove us wrong, and then decided that they were going to use our method to regulate insurance. So my impact there is I made you guys probably pay more for car insurance. We're also going to investigate the platforms, right? We think there's sort of two. We can't, as especially in today's world, we can't ignore that they exist. We think that there's not a lot of oversight over local algorithms like car insurance or risk scores or anything like that. We also think that there's not a lot of oversight over the platforms themselves. And so in the past, what we did at ProPublica is we did the same sort of scientific method, right? So in 2017, last year, at the end of last year, when we were doing this, there was no way to look at political ads online. We were talking with some colleagues in Germany, and they were having an election, and we thought, as sort of a trial balloon, as sort of like a first data collection practice, let's launch a browser extension. It's a little plugin for your browser that you install in your browser. It goes through your timeline, and it rates. It goes through your timeline and sucks out all of the ads. We built a machine learning classifier, which was relatively simple to classify whether or not an ad was political or not, based on our reader's judgment, right? So we asked every reader to look at all of the ads in their timeline and rate them as political or not political. And then we showed them the ads that other people were seeing that they weren't seeing. And we thought that that this was going to be, it might have worked better now, but we thought in Germany that we would see a lot of people running political content that wasn't regulated or wasn't, or was like a disinformation campaign or something like that. We didn't really end up seeing that. We did catch one group in Germany that was just completely fake news. They branded themselves as, what was it? Completely fake. They branded themselves as the Green Party. But when you went to their website, and it was all well designed, and it looked like the Green Party. When you went to their website, their slogan was "The Greens must be crazy." That was a pretty good story. But the more we started looking into the data, the more that we saw all of these links to malware. So sites that were actively trying to hack your computer when you clicked on the link. And we saw a bunch of scams. And that seemed like a more important story to normal folks, right? If you see anything on Facebook and you click on it and tries to hack your computer, that's a public safety issue. That wasn't being covered, that was kind of lost in the coverage. And we saw much more of this across our entire data set than we did of political scams or anything like that. So again, we started with a hypothesis. We collected some data. We looked at the data and we found political ads that were scams and malware. More importantly, we saw that top companies in the United States were discriminating based on ads, based on age for job ads. So what they would do is they would run an ad that says, we only want men 25 to 35. which may be a violation of EEOC rules, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And we found 40 companies doing this, not that ranged all the way from small companies like Bob's Red Mill all the way to large companies like the tech companies themselves. This is a problem for that affects a wider swath of people, right? If you're searching for a job, Facebook picks up on that you're searching for a job, and you're maybe 36 or 40 or 50, and you don't get to see the job ads that you would be eminently qualified for, that's discrimination. We also plan to do not quite as much, but in the past we have done this. A lot of investigations into the ways in which governments and nation states, spy on the internet, their operations and moves online. But we're going to do it in the same way that we do our investigations back over here, right? We're going to do it in the way that, again, we have a theory. We try and collect some data, whether it be leaked documents or something like that. And then we prove the theory via looking at the actual source material. The idea that you get 4 anonymous sources in today's world where you have to have bulletproof stories doesn't pan out. And so I'm going to show you 2 stories here, 2 or 3 stories where it really, really helped to have people who were technically minded, who were programmers, looking through source documents. In 2013, Snowden documents hit, right? We get the very first stories about PRISM, about the FISA order, the Verizon FISA order, where they're collecting a log of phone calls from every single person in the United States, right? Those are easy stories to do. It took 2 years for us to really prove that AT&T and the NSA had a very, very close partnership together. So much so that AT&T agents were working within NSA facilities and NSA agents were working within AT&T facilities. And what we did was we had heard through sources that this was the case, right? And a bunch of people had written, anonymous source says that this is the case. So there's the famous Mark Klein room. The lawsuits against this invasion of privacy had never really gone anywhere because they couldn't actually prove that they had standing. They couldn't actually prove that it was AT&T. They were all just circumspect. So what we did, what I noticed being a programmer is I noticed a bunch of very, very, very technical jargon in there, like service node routing complexes, or the common backbone, or peering link routing complexes. And I was able to go and reach out to former employees of all of the major telecoms and ask them, do you guys use this terminology in your company? And the only people that were able to tell me that yes, we did use that terminology was AT&T. So I noticed that in the document. And it was just like kind of throwaway lines which you wouldn't pay attention to if you weren't, if you were trying to make a circumspect case, right? If you were relying on anonymous sources, you could put up an anonymous source saying, this is happening, and then a slide and say, you guys all figure it out. But we went the extra mile. We actually, for this story, for the main bar, we wrote it like a news story, but we wrote much longer methodology about how we actually proved it. So being completely transparent about it. Similar sort of thing happened in a story that I worked on with a bunch of people at the New York Times. what I noticed in the Snowden documents very early on was the fact that uh, uh, the NSA, whose whole reason for existence is to break encryption, had solved it somehow, right? Had solved the encryption that you use to communicate with your bank, you use to communicate with Facebook. He had somehow figured out some straight up cryptographic break, or had figured out how to monitor that traffic in 2011. And we couldn't quite figure it out for a long time. We spent 6 months. We talked to experts. We were like, how could this happen? We took a deep dive into the archive. I actually wrote some software to pull out, promising documents to sort of like delve deeper into it. And so we could have gone with, well, it looks like they broke a bunch, but we don't have a theory on why it happened. Kept on going through, looking really, really very closely at these documents in like a super deep way. And we noticed that they had this thing called the SIGINT Enabling Project, which actively engages the US and foreign IT industries to covertly influence or overtly leverage a commercial product's design. In English, that means the NSA has a program of building backdoors into the software that we use, right? This is a national security risk, right? This is a thing that is a capability that the NSA probably should have, but it also puts all of us at risk, right? So we're holding the powerful to account here. We knew that, they're an agency of code breakers, but we also wanted to make sure that, but we didn't know how they were doing it. And this is the best that we got out of that. So that was a fun one. And then the final story, this is me on a boat. And you may wonder what I'm doing on a boat. I am on a boat in Palm Beach, Florida. Anybody know where Palm Beach is? Anybody know what's in Palm Beach? Yeah, how often? This is my friend Surya Matu, who is a programmer and a former Bell Labs engineer and an investigative data journalist. And this is a Wi-Fi antenna pointed at Mar-a-Lago. So you guys remember in 2017, after the election, there was a Politico story based on some Instagram pictures that were taken at the Mar-a-Lago club, where it's Donald Trump and the president and prime minister of Japan, and North Korea just launched a missile, and they're all on their phones, right? And so the day one story is anybody could hack those phones, right? Relying on innuendo, you go out and you grab a couple of experts to say, how likely is it are these phones hacked? And they say, well, we can't be sure because we haven't tested it. It's pretty likely that those phones are hacked, right? So what Surya and I did, mostly because we wanted to go to Florida, is we got to talking about it, and we pitched our editors. He was at Gizmodo at the time, and I was at ProPublica, and we pitched our editors, and we said, we have a hypothesis, right? We have done a bunch of research. There are crowdsourced maps online. We've done a bunch of digging into Mar-a-Lago and who runs Mar-a-Lago and the systems and software there. And we think that if we go down there, we will be able to point out the actual vulnerabilities that are national security risks, right? So again, a hypothesis, right? So we flew out the next day with our Wi-Fi antenna, and we drove around first, but there's no parking. So we went and rented a boat, drove down there and scanned the Wi-Fi, and we found that there were open printers that literally two dumb journalists could break into Mar-a-Lago. We didn't stop there. We also went to all of his clubs on the East Coast. So we went to Bedminster. We went to the one in Virginia. We went to the Trump Hotel, and we found that all of them had serious security risks, the places he likes to hang out. That's a cool story. We also looked at what, but it's not quite enough, right? Because what did other presidents do? Barack Obama went golfing from time to time, right? Other presidents, by and large, vacation at Camp David. And so we did a little bit of digging. We asked around about Camp David, and we found that Camp David has, just for Wi-Fi security alone, spends about $25 million on cybersecurity. Donald Trump at one point sued the city of Palm Beach because the airport lines flew over his club, and he said membership was going down. As part of the discovery, they had to publish the budget for Mar-a-Lago. Mar-a-Lago spent at that time, we don't know what it spends now, spent at that time $200,000. So this is like silly and fun, but it has like a serious sort of upshot to it. That these are national security conversations, national security risks that are occurring. There's an easy way to tell that story, which is this may be happening. But what we want to do as the markup is we want to say this is actually happening. Here's why we know this is happening. We're going to do, everything from data journalism to crowdsourcing to, relying on our own expertise to figure things out. And finally, just going out, renting boats and testing stuff. That's what I got. So I'm about 5 minutes too fast, but I normally talk very quickly. So we have a lot to talk about if you guys want to talk about stuff. I mean, yeah, I touched a lot about it on this. I want to give you a little bit of historical context about data journalism in general. We think of data journalism as Nate Silver, the popular conception, when it really, really took off. It was around 2006 to 8, maybe 12, it depends, is Nate Silver and prediction models, or graphics, and fancy charts and graphs online. That makes a lot of sense. Like, I love that stuff too, right? It's all great. Data journalism as a practice has existed, running things like regressions and cleaning data as a practice has existed since around the late 80s. But often what happens in newsrooms is journalist has a theory, goes to the data desk and says, I need some facts for my theory. We're going to invert that, right? We're going to take this programmer-centric model. We have theories not only about national security, we have theories about how algorithms are used. We're going to start out with, we have a theory, let's test that hypothesis and publish our results. In order to do that, especially when we're covering technology, we need to have some programming muscle ourselves, right? Especially when we're covering platforms, for example. Last year they didn't, now they have an ads API, but last year they didn't. So we had to write software to get that out of Facebook. To analyze 24 million quotes in 50 states around the country, you can't do that in Excel, right? You need to do that with programming. You need to winnow it down. You also need to write software when you're dealing with that scale to make sure that it's largely correct. So our theory is really that when you're investigating technology, you should be using the technology and the algorithms to be able to do that. It makes for a better story. It makes for more proof. It also gives you something. What we do in each one of these stories is we come up with our conclusion, and then we send it out to academics, and we ask them to sort of review it. It gives you something to also have a more grown-up and adult conversation with the companies, because when you go to a PR person and say, hey, I have these graphs, and they're not too good for you, they get their scientists on the line so we can have a grown-up conversation about what's actually happening, instead of them just going away, writing a press release saying you're wrong, and we're not going to say why we're wrong. We find it a better, more accurate way of doing journalism. Yeah.
So a few months ago, the United First Amendment Institute issued a public letter to Facebook, urging them to create a safe harbor for journalists conducting public interest investigations. And specifically, it argued that Facebook should allow the automated collection of public user data. And so, like, the conversation was largely based on the technical terms of service and not on the ethics behind that. And so, I'm wondering, how do you personally navigate the ethics of your work, and what obligations do you think journalists have to protect privacy?
Yeah, I kind of follow like a Hippocratic oath, like do no harm. If I'm collecting a lot of data, right, I don't want to make it worse for people, right? You know, there's some balancing act that you have to do there. Criminal records are public, right? Putting people's names, you have to be in a story is a sensitive topic. You have to say, well, this is going to be in your Google search results, you know, right, for a long time. Specifically when it comes to the terms of service, for the political ad collector as a specific example, we're doing something that is violating the terms of service, right? We're using software to scrape Facebook. You know, LinkedIn famously sued a company for doing this exact thing, right? There's precedent out there. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act may come into play. Computer Fraud and Abuse Act basically is this weird thing where it enshrines the terms of service with federal enforcement. So you can say no scraping of my website, and if someone scrapes your website, you can bring them to court. And it's come up with in a bunch of cases in the past. So what we want is, we think that this has actual public good. We think that like pointing out that there are scams and malware on Facebook is like a safety issue. We think that pointing out job ads that may be discriminatory pending court cases is a public good, but we can't do it if we're under threat of litigation all the time. So Julia signed that letter asking for this exception. The second part of your question is, when we're scraping Facebook, how do we make sure that we're not like doing something that Cambridge Analytica is doing, right? You know, or doing something that data brokers, and we're not just exfiltrating data willy-nilly. And we put a lot of thought into this, right? Because this is a sensitive ask for people. We're going to use software to scrape your Facebook page, right? And we promise that we won't collect anything. So private companies often will say, we promise we won't collect anything. That's the Cambridge Analytica idea. That's the Zynga idea. What we do is twofold. We ask experts, because we are journalists, if you were to do, before we sit down and write code, if you were to do this, what would be the things that I would look out for, or you would look out for? And in this case, we asked a couple experts, and they were like, well, okay, so at the end of every URL, there's usually a tracking ID, so you want to get rid of those. You want to make sure that you're getting rid of any Facebook identifiers in there when you read it into your database. And then you also want to make sure that you're not, you want to make absolutely certain on a global level that you can't tie an individual ad back to a person if you're Facebook, right? That is like sort of, people call them threat models, right? So our sort of idea behind it was, it would be very easy just to send a raw copy of whatever's in the HTML page to ourselves, but that would include identifiers and like all sorts of sensitive information. And it'll include who among your friends like that ad, so we're outing your friends too. And so what we did is we did a lot of testing. We did about like 3 weeks 3 or 4 weeks of testing where we got a bunch of beta testers to make sure that we weren't collecting any of that data. And then we wiped that database and started all over. So it's an ethical decision, right? Like you have to plan ahead of time when you're collecting these sorts of things. For the other ethical decision is like the risk scores here. I think that we ended up publishing the entire data under the argument that it's public anyway, right? You know, we FOIA'd it. You can go to the jail website. I think nowadays I probably would have redacted names and date of births and stuff. But this story was so fraught with analysis that we wanted people to be able to recreate our analysis on a certain level, and they have. We've got like 120 citations on it, but I do think that nowadays I would have been a little bit more sensitive about publishing people's criminal histories in the way that we did. It's a movable thing, right? Every story is, you know, you kind of pick your boundaries, and you don't want to do more harm, right? Like you don't want people to get harmed for helping you out, or the people that you're trying to focus on in your story to be harmed in any other sort of way. Yeah, we went to ProPublica originally, and you know, we asked them. We were like, we really think there should be a ProPublica.tech, right? And you know, they said to it, and it was a long conversation, right? And it was a lot of back and forth. And they essentially said, you guys can keep on doing what you're doing, which I obviously love. Like I love every single one of these stories. They take way too long, but I love them. But for me and Julia and one other programmer, that's one story a year. And that's okay for ProPublica, because ProPublica is the investigative newsroom for the entire country, right? That's what they aim to be. That's their mission statement. So they have to cover things like the border, you know, elections. They have to cover things like hell and high water, like environmental stuff, right? So they have a wide mission. And so we went to them and we said, we'd like to do ProPublica.tech. We build, instead of just us as a team, 5 teams. And they said, you know, that is a cool idea. You guys should go and do that. And that is really how the conversation went. And so we went and did it. Yeah. So could we exist within another news organization? Probably. An opportunity, and we think that there's an actual need to do this kind of journalism that isn't really practiced, you know, out there in the world. Good. Yeah. I love my iPhone. I love my MacBook. I think, yeah, that's such a hard thing, right? Like, because I use all of these. Like, you know, I'm on Twitter all the time. I think, you know, the only thing, the hard and fast thing is never click on an ad, because it might hack your thing. And use an ad blocker. I think that, you know, we all have our communities and our spaces, right? Like they're not wrong when they talk about like building communities. They have sort of missed the downsides of that. I think for an average user, being knowledgeable of what is actually going on behind the scenes, being knowledgeable of the dark corners or the corners, like ad tracking or data brokers or anything like that, is something that we need to raise the level of literacy on. If you read The Verge and Motherboard and Ars Technica and news sites, you're definitely already there, but I think normal folks don't have that sort of writ large, have that sort of like baseline knowledge. I think right now we're in a situation where it's a weird metaphor, but stick with me for a second. We had cars for 40 years before we put seatbelts in, right? We've had technology for about 40 years. It's time to put the seatbelts in, and we let it go rampant. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done on both sides, raising consumer knowledge and consumer advocacy through civil society, and also this constant drumbeat of we're so sorry we messed up, right? Like if Dow Chemical said, oh, we're so sorry we messed up, right? Or Ford had said, we're so sorry we messed up. Like it's about time. You're all grown-ups now, right? Mark Zuckerberg's a grown-up, right? Like let's just start acting that way, you know, and you know, lashing out at mean journalists or whatever. So I don't have like tried and true ideas on that. I think it's a very personal decision. But I do think just knowing about the darker corners, knowing about that is like a level that as journalists, we can also help. So business model right now is get foundations and people to give us money, because that's how we're going to start. I think in the future, you know, there's investigative journalism is never going to be like the most popular thing in the world, right? But neither is the opera. And there is a core group of people that believe that the opera should exist, right? And so I think crowdfunding can work. It certainly worked at ProPublica post-Trump. I think that we have 4 years to figure it out, which is scary for me to say. But I think that's definitely one way. Building a core audience of people that can donate to it. Investigative journalism is also very expensive. It's not like based, but I do think that there is the idea of a public good, and I think the way that which is not relying on sources, but relying on investigations that are bulletproof and big. ProPublica does a lot of that too. I think that is, I'm very much in the mindset that like this can both equalize the level of discourse in investigative journalism and provide worth to people, right? Because we are talking about math, right? We are having grown-up conversations, the same grown-up conversations that I'm saying Facebook needs to have, right? But I don't know, that's just how I feel. And I have to believe that there are enough people out there to support the investigative nonprofits that already exist, I think. Yeah, and we're going to be based in New York. Why? Based in New York because it's where everybody lives right now. We've hired. I think that having been a journalist out here in San Francisco going on 2 years now, I see for a news organization that is not anti-access, but wary of access, I see a lot of access risks here. Technology companies don't act the same way that say political political sources do. Technology companies hold off-the-record dinners, right? And off-the-record press calls and off-the-record dinner parties. And I do see that there is a risk of being captured living out here, going to, RSA parties, right? Or whatever. And so I think it makes sense to do it from New York because we're not relying on access. probably could. These two are 3 people for a year, so I mean, we're working. It's not like a year total where we turn our brains off and don't do anything else. If you're talking about just like total salary from beginning to end, right? $200,000 anywhere, depending on how big it is, like anywhere up to like, you could say $1 million, but that's a misleading metric because while we were doing that, we were also reporting on Facebook, right? So 4 or 5. So it still is very expensive in terms of man hours. The data that we bought for this, I think it was $80,000 for the data, right? And it varies by and large. So the goal is, it may be easier to do it this way. The goal is to, just like ProPublica, to publish anywhere, especially when they started, anywhere from 8 to 12 investigations a year with, a $5 or $6 million budget. And also daily stories, right? Like the bar is in news, you've got to have something that's new all the time, just to stay focused. So that's high touch. That's, it takes a lot of money, which is why we're putting more resources towards the investigations than the other thing. I think for these high touch ones, the first 2 that I showed, it is about the same as it, like if you're talking about like, a Boston Globe pre-story where they built their own data set, right? Like that's a year's worth of work, right? So for these high touch investigations where you're dealing with dirty data that you FOIA or you buy or whatever, it is very much artisanal and handcrafted. I think that for investigations like this that rely on crowdsourcing, and talking to computers via APIs or HTML, these are definitely getting faster. And part of the thing that we're doing now is we're building tools to do more of this sort of stuff, because if we build those tools to go out and scrape the internet or scrape Facebook or build browser extensions very quickly, we can amp up the data collection, make sure that data is clean at the time that we store it in our databases, and then it becomes much, much faster. The problem with these stories is, like machine bias in the car insurance, is always that no one, big data is mostly a lie. It's mostly a big mess. That every data set I've ever gotten or received from anybody has always required months and months of cleaning. Like no one really knows how to keep their data clean or accurate, because they're playing for the average, right? And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if 1% of your data is just total garbage. But in journalism, 1% of your data is 1% of a correction, right? So, and could skew your thing. So you have to do a lot more fact checking there. I think there's a huge, just sort of story area wise, I think there's a huge opportunity to crowdsource, especially in Europe, because of the GDPR, and that people can request their data there, that people have taken chunks at, but we definitely want to look at. I think crowdsourcing on the platforms outside of the United States, in areas where the platforms don't have an actual on the ground presence, or they're American companies or whatever, is a rich vein, right? I think that the political ad collector in other countries, not necessarily countries that have strict limits on political speech, or strict regulations on political speech. Like Germany was kind of a mistake. They have, for obvious reasons, because they messed up last century, have very, very strict rules on what you can put online. We have the FEC, which also sort of like, moderates that now, and Facebook woke up to it, but I would love to see what's going on in the Ukraine, right, in terms of political speech, or maybe, South America, like in Brazil. I think that there's a huge opportunity for that. And the only way that we're going to be able to see it, because these things are all ephemeral in terms of platforms, is by building these crowdsourced investigations, by asking people, partnering with organizations there, asking people to, help us out, getting knowledge on the ground, that kind of thing. I think for the other stories, the stories about algorithms that are in use in the United States, like there's just like a knowledge gap, such a knowledge gap. Like we know what Facebook looks like in the United States. We kind of understand what it looks like down, in different countries, but we have no idea how car insurance even works, right? Or we won't be able to tell what risk assessment is. Like we don't know what felonies, that kind of thing. So I do think that there is a huge opportunity for more crowdsourcing, especially through browser extensions. Yeah. And call outs and partnerships.
No, we're using Free the Files.
Yeah, Free the Files, right. Free the Files was a thing that that we did at ProPublica 2012 election, where we were monitoring TV ads. At that time, they hadn't put a database up online of TV speech, so we asked everybody around the country to go to their local TV station, which you guys can all do this weekend if you want to. It's kind of fun, and ask for a list of all the TV ads that ran on their TV station. The problem is it's not data, right? Like you literally have to ask, and it's just people sign, and so we had to ask folks out in the world to basically type in what each one of these things say, and it was hugely successful. We got a lot of them out of that, and so I think also things like using Mechanical Turk and like upping that game would be good. I think investigative journalism is headed much more towards source material, actual proof, right? We no longer are constrained by column inches, which is both good and bad, right? Like the 11,000 word on a story on Trump's taxes shouldn't have been 11,000 words, right? Like we should have had a series and a drumbeat. But by the same token, they put up the actual stuff that they were looking at. Like, here's the actual proof, right? Like, we actually went and we have a methodology that we followed, and we talked to the tax guy, and there's a long sort of period in there where they're like, here's exactly how we do it. So we have this glorious opportunity in investigative journalism to move away from, deep throat and meeting in the car park. That is still very, very useful as the start of your investigation. Getting that tip, right? Like getting that tip, picking up that phone, talking to folks, doing source relationships and building sources from the ground up. I'm not denigrating it, but it's not enough anymore, right? People need to see the email. People need to see the documents. And I think this is like not anything that's new. I think, Document Cloud, which is a repository which you guys probably have come across, was developed in 2009, 2010, right? We're a decade on from this. I think realizing that source material is not, the argument against publishing source material is always no one's going to look at it. And it's like, that's okay, right? Like no one needs to look at it. They just need to know it's there. Right? And who is going to look at it are the lawyers, right? And the civil society group and the people that are actually like journalists' role in life is to point out problems, right? So you can point out a problem like Mark Klein in the AT&T room. Mark Klein was a whistleblower that noticed that they were wiretapping and thought it was the NSA. It was a 10-year-long case just based on that anecdote, right? That they didn't have the actual proof. They had a little bit of diagrams. They got a bunch of discovery, but now we have the actual proof. Putting that proof out there on a white paper that maybe like 100 people read is still valuable for society. And I think we'll see more of that. I think more transparency, not less, in terms of sources. There still will always be anonymous sources because it's always going to be the case, but we have the ability to build on what they're telling us. And I think there'll be more and more of that. I also think investigations will get quicker, right? Like, I think, it might have been in the way that the Boston Globe did with the pre-scandal that was in the movie Spotlight. We do just a drumbeat, right? Like, a story a week, right? One of the things that I wish I had done with both of these two stories was this was 4 states. Should have been 4 stories. Here's what's happened in California, right? We only looked at 1 county out of the 3,000 counties. All of Wisconsin uses it, right? Like, there's a bunch of follow-ups here that could happen. So building investigations over time, not dropping them on a yearly calendar. Well, that's what we did last year, but like continuing to investigate things is something that I hope and I think will go forward. We're always working on 10 bad ideas, and we only publish the least bad of those. We always, investigative journalism, like, it's not like you go into a cave and you read a bunch of documents and you come out with like an amazing thing. Like, you're picking an area, like you go out and you talk to sources, or you read the Federal Register, or you read a lot of things like the Eric Holder quote, which is why we looked at this. He gave that speech. We were following Eric Holder closely because we were working on NSA stuff. He was the Attorney General, right? And he said that thing, and we were like, that's interesting. After we get our heads out of this, we'll go and look into that, right? At the same time, we're always also looking at 4 or 5 other things, and they fail for various reasons, or we don't get close enough to that answer. But I have like 30 or 40 stories that I'll get to at some point. So that's why it's like hard to pin a price tag on the individual, like on an individual story. It's because there's ongoing work. Like, you're still waiting for that data to come in or that data to be clean. Like, I'm the programmer, so I'm working with the data. Julia is maybe working on some other story while I'm working through the data to see if this thing pans out. Or she's in Chicago in the winter, which I've never heard the end of it, for the car insurance story. And I'm working on the next story. I'm building Facebook, looking at Facebook political ads. Yeah, so we do. For this story, we worked with an epidemiologist, at Stanford. For this story, it was with Consumer Reports, so it was like 5 PhDs. For the political ad collector, it was mostly people who used to work at Facebook who I talked to in social media platforms, but we often do. We have very good relationships with a number of academics out there in the world, who we go to like review our work, and like when we have a tricky problem, we'll ask them like, how do you do this sort of thing. The collaborations, direct collaborations where you're like working on a thing, and we write about it, like that happens very rarely, just because it's a different was a different role in society, right? Like it's creating knowledge. Investigative journalism is uncovering what's actually already there and has actually been happening. So there's sort of like different sort of approaches, I think. None of the stuff that we do in investigative journalism is news, right? Compass has been being used for a decade. Car insurance has been around forever. Redlining has continually been a problem. And so that's why we in our sort of blurb on the site, that's literally why we choose this word illuminating, right? Because that's really what we're doing. It's not secret. It's not stuff no one knows. It's stuff a lot of people know that we're pointing out like, hey, this could be a problem. I've never. Yeah, I mean, we're fair. Like, we ask them why they do that, right? Like, or why it's happening. In every single one of these investigations that I pointed out, outside of the Mar-a-Lago one where they called us terrorists, the company has been shocked to hear. They didn't set out. Car insurance companies didn't set out to do this, right? We talked to them over the course of 6 months. We talked to them very early. We said, we found this. We worked through this methodology a lot. We talked to their business people and tried to understand the ways in which they did. We never got a direct answer. We got a couple loose answers on that. But there's never like a twirling mustache. We're not out to get bad guys. You know, there are people who do that very well, but we're not that, right? The people who wrote this risk algorithm were like on the verge of tears when we said because they believed in it, right? They believed that they were taking the bias out of things. And I felt for them, and we wrote it in such a way. They then published the 38-page white paper, so we're no longer friends. That's all gone. So we do hear it out, right? All of this stuff, my theory is all of this stuff isn't intentional. It's just an accident. It's like Tolstoy believes that the French lost the war not because Russia had a better army, just because Russia like is Russia, right? You know, and it's like Facebook is doing this because Facebook is Facebook right now, right? So. I think we're going to do that. I don't think we're going to do that. We did that at ProPublica a lot. I think we're going to do that very selectively. Reporting recipes are always good. I think we're going to also rely on partnerships and stuff like that. This one is hard and not replicable because of the ways in which, without a similar level of work, because felonies and misdemeanors mean different things in different counties, right? You know? And so like a large portion of was researching, but certainly we do plan to do 50 state stories as much as possible. We always strive for a 50 state story. And when we do have a 50 state story, holding conference calls and posting reporting recipes just makes total sense. ProPublica is really good at that in healthcare. Because we are in it to amplify our work, definitely. Yeah, we were lucky enough to get Sue Gardner, the former head of Wikipedia, that took Wikipedia from 6 million a year and 6 people in St. Petersburg, Florida, to 100 people in San Francisco and $400 million a year. And so it's not her first rodeo. So she was very clear. Like, we got an initial seed grant, right, from a collaboration in a fund to investigate algorithms, like do the kind of thing that we're doing, right? Out of the Berkman Center, Knight Foundation is part of it, MIT is a part of it, and they give us like enough money to get through the summer, right? And so we were lucky enough to get Sue Gardner. Sue Gardner knows the landscape. The other thing that we did about 2 or 3 months worth of research after we left on who to target. We went on the road talking to literally everybody. We got Craig, the Knight Foundation, the Ford Foundation, a bunch of other foundations very interested. It's not just Craig Newmark. And I think we hit the sweet spot at the right time. I think Sue is very good at crafting our message. I can't take a lot of credit for that. What I did was scrape every foundation website to see who they're funding and what and why, and try and figure out which foundations were going to help us out. But yeah, that's a better question for her. She's talked a lot about nonprofit fundraising and stuff, and she's super smart.
And she came as a college partner?
Yeah, I mean, she joined us. That was, we were thinking on going on our own. And so we started talking to people who would like help us with the business side, because we're journalists. We're getting better at the business side, but that's not our calling. So we were just talking with a bunch of people, seeing if we could do this, weighing our options with ProPublica and stuff like that. And then Julia had been friends with Sue Gardner for years and just asked her, and Sue was like, yeah, this sounds like a good thing. We were incredibly lucky to have her. So she's our executive director. And is just really like helping us build this and make it into a real thing.
All right, we're out of time.
Out of time. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, guys.